we've been talking about in Genesis 1, and what spoke over in 1 Genesis 2, is that God in creation took primordial chaos, into nothingness of just the waters in the physical world, and transformed it into a cosmic temple. Cosmic is just a big fancy word that biblical scholars use for universal. We might say planetary wide. So you can just think of it in terms of that. We left off with after day 3, so let's review these first 3 days we talked about last week, and then we'll jump into days 4 through 6, and if we can, also day 7 in the same day. So, it's very, very important for us to start out with this. The ancients did not have scientific language, they did not have scientific thinking. Everybody thought phenomenologically. That was a big fancy word that we looked at last week. What does phenomenological language mean? Good. It's a big fancy word, but just there to give a very simple definition. Phenomenological language describes the way things look to the naked human eye. Example, the sun rises on the earth. Right? Nobody looks at the sun and says, it's the center of our solar system. The earth is rotating around this. And nobody actually speaks scientifically. Nobody really even thinks scientifically. Even the scientists, they still speak and think phenomenologically. It's too deeply ingrained in the human experience. So the Bible will describe things from the universal human experience. Not an exact scientific representation, okay? So we can stop with the whole idea that Genesis 1 is going to try and answer scientific questions. Genesis 1, Genesis 2, eventually we'll look at Psalm 74, Psalm 89, creation goes there, Isaiah 25. None of these places are actually trying to speak scientifically, and that's okay. What we don't want to do is impose our modern thinking and our modern expectations back on ancient Hebrew texts, like the Bible. If we do that, we're going to miss understanding the story. By the way, get the Bible out and open up to Genesis 1. I'm going to have scriptures up on screen, so reach under your chairs and pull that out. From this point on, I've always wanted to have a Bible verse, so I'll just review one of these. Genesis 1. We'll get to the verse in a second. So, here's my proposition. Science and the Bible can both be true in as far as the claims that they are attempting to make are valid claims. This is a little bit of clarity to what I didn't exactly say last week. So Genesis 1:1 all the way through 2:3, the creation story, is not attempting to make scientific claims about the origin of the universe. How could it be attempting to make scientific claims when nobody made scientific claims or asked scientific questions until about the 1500s? They didn't even start. Logan, you're right. They can't be trying to make those claims because those claims didn't exist. They're not thinking that way, and they're not writing their story that way. So science does not have...
Lots to get through today. So I want to just dive right into Genesis chapter 2. But let's start, before we get to day 7 here, let's review the first 6 days of creation in rapid succession. So the 6 days of creation that we've already covered can be broken up into 2 groups. Group 1, day 1, God makes light. He creates the order of time, day and night out of the light. Whoa, that rhymed. Okay. Day 2, the order of the heavens, the sky, and the vault. Basically, it's weather patterns that are kind of the point of day 2. But remember that they consider the earth flat, and that the dome and the vault that is described on day 2, they thought was a literal hard-covered dome that existed and covered the land. And so they describe it as the vault. That is one way that you'll see it in certain scriptures. But the order of the heavens just means sky, so you don't need to freak out about that. But we talked about that on previous lessons. And then day 3, the order of the earth or the land brings group 1 to a close. So the land is brought up out of the primordial chaos waters, and then God creates the second thing on day 3, the vegetation, the plants, the trees, the shrubbery. But anyways, so 2 things get created on day 3, and the realms of order are brought to a close. And then we come to day 4. And what does God create in group 2? Living creatures that fill the realms. And on day 4, he creates what? He goes back to what he does on day 1. And what are the living creatures that make up day 4? Good. The stars and what else? What? And the sun and the moon. Good. Yeah, I'm not trying to trick you. These are obvious answers. So the sun, moon, and stars are considered alive to the ancients. Why? Because they move from the human perspective of phenomenological language that they use to write these stories and perceive the universe. The sun, the moon, the stars, they move, so they consider them alive and living beings. So they fall into these categories of living beings to the ancient mind. Day 5, the heavens are filled. The waters below are filled with fish. The waters above are filled with birds. But they don't really consider it the creation of 2 different things. They're just the creation of one thing, something to fill the heavens, but they're distinct because the waters below are not filled with the same creatures as the waters above. But on day 6, he does create 2 distinct categories of creatures. The animals, just all land-dwelling animals, get made. corresponding to day 3, the land is full of animals, but then humanity gets made. And humanity is the climax of all these created things. In fact, since day 1, everything's been heading towards the creation of mankind. Everything is built and designed to fulfill man's purpose and give man a home. The land is there. The time is there. 24-hour days is there. The heavens are there for the humans to live under. Why are man and woman the creation, the climax of creation in Genesis 1? Because they are what? Good, Logan. They are in God's image. Humanity is the climax as God's created being because they are made in God's image, which means they are given the gifted status of the rulers of the created order. Now they're under God and his celestial family, the angelic beings, the us that is there in Genesis 1:27. We'll talk more about that after we get through Genesis 2. I'll circle back around. We'll put Genesis 1 and 2 together, and I'll show you more on these celestial families before we get to Genesis 3, and one of those celestial beings turns against God and humanity. Bum, bum, bum. The poetic statement in Genesis 1:27 is there to emphasize the importance of these created human beings, these image bearers, you and me. The break in the poetry, I'm sorry, I said that wrong. The break in the narrative to speak poetry and then go back to narrative tells you, slow down and pay attention to this. Humans are important. They are made in God's image. In the image of God, he made them. Male and female, he made them. So, in relation to everything else that's come before, since day 1, humans are the last but most important creation. All humans possess the status of image bearer and are therefore worthy of dignity and respect beyond that of any animal or any other physical creation like the moon and the stars. So when you get people who treat their animals like their children, they don't realize that they're actually kind of insulting to God because he makes humans greater and more distinct. And for you to treat your animal with love and respect is good, but to treat them like they're a human is one step too far because they're not. They do not have the same status that you possess as an image bearer. They don't get to rule creation. You do. When people think that meat is murder and they think that eating animals is inherently wrong because they're living creatures, they're trying to make the playing field level as if humans aren't designed by God to be above the animals. You are above the animals. You don't have to treat animals like they're people. They're not people. People are different and distinct as far as Genesis 1 is concerned and the whole Bible. And let me just add this because I didn't say this last week. This will get us more into Genesis 2, but I'm just throwing this out there for the moment because it's part of the poetic statement. Male and female are both image bearers. It's not just man. It's not just women. It is men and women together make up the image of God. This is kind of a distinct thing from the ancient world. All of humanity shares the status of image bearers because in the ancient world, it was pretty much just kings. You were a king, you were considered a god or the offspring of a god oftentimes. And so you could be considered in the image of God and everybody else was not, so you could treat them a certain way. And because of that, a lot of the abuse that has been hurled on people, male and female, throughout history, comes from the inability to see other people who don't look like you, think like you, talk like you, act like you in some way, shape, or form. We don't treat them as human because they don't look or think or act or talk like you, but they are. Because being an image bearer of God does not mean being a 21st century white American. Okay, so that'll take us into chapter 2. We'll talk more about that again, but throwing that out there because I kind of didn't touch on that when we got there. Okay, so this is from the Bible Project video that we watched. This is just how they broke things down a little bit visually. So here's the 6 days of creation, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. and then the image bearers ruling over these three orders of creation, ruling over the living beings within them. So that's one way that they helpfully picture Genesis 1 and the creation of humans. And that brings us up to Genesis chapter 2, verse 1. Look in your Bibles right here, because this ends chapter 1, the story anyway. It says, "Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array." Well, that's simple. Why is this the end of the story of Genesis 1? What is it connecting back to? I'll give you a visual representation that also came from the Bible Project video that we watched several weeks ago. The very first line is what? The first line in the Bible. Created what? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So this line, "so were completed the skies and the land and all," or the heavens and the earth, is just another interpretation of that, "and all their inhabitants," links back to the very first statement and draws these stories to a close in a certain respect, but then he's going to keep going with day 7. So you can see group 1, group 2, days 1 through 3, days 4 through 6, boom, the work is complete, but there's still something left undone as far as the week of creation is concerned. Day 7 has a purpose. So in my own visual style, I just threw this together. If you think of creation as a hierarchy and God's moving towards something, the pinnacle of the pyramid, you got days 1 through 3, the realms of order down here, and then days 4 through 6 sit on top of that. But days 4 through 6 can be broken up into various portions. Day 4, the sun, the moon, the stars. Day 5, the creation of the water-dwelling animals and the birds, although I didn't have a bird clip to put up here. And then day 6, the land-dwelling animals are still down here, but then the creation of humanity are above these other ones. This is what I was saying when I said people who treat animals like they're people don't understand that this is the hierarchy that God actually put in order in Genesis 1. You have the right to decide what you're going to do with these creatures in days 4 through 6. You can domesticate some. You can keep others as pets. You have certain autonomy and control that they do not have. But something else is still missing because there's a 7th day of creation. It says this, verses 2 through 3, and this is all we'll read today and go over. "By the 7th day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the 7th day, he rested from all of his work. Then God blessed the 7th day and made it holy." It means he set it apart as something being distinct and different from the other 6 days. He made it holy because on it he rested from all the work of creating he had done. Now, let's break this down because God rest or Sabbath, and nobody knows how to deal with this in modern American thinking. Sabbath, what does Sabbath mean? Sabbath is a Hebrew word that just means rest. So when people talk about the Sabbath day, they're talking about the 7th day of creation, which is what day of the week? Say it again, a little louder, Ashley. Yeah, see, that's the thing. Some people will talk about the Sabbath being on Sunday, and other people talk about it being on Saturday. If you're even today, if you have a modern Jewish calendar, the day starts at 6 o'clock on Friday evening, according to our calendar. The Sabbath is Friday at 6 till Saturday at 6 because they use a lunar calendar, not a solar calendar like we use. So we start the day at midnight, in the middle of the night, because the sun hasn't risen yet. It's interesting. So the Sabbath is the 7th day of creation, which is Saturday. We'll cover that more on a different time when we get to Exodus and the 10 Commandments in this lesson series. But the day of rest is at the end of the week, and that's Saturday. So let's get that right from the start. But God is not a physical being. He has no need for physical rest. He's created a physical universe. He's created a physical home, but he himself is not a physical being. So here's my proposition. His rest has nothing whatsoever to do with needing to stop working and recuperate physically. His rest is going to be about something else entirely. Now, most people who read Genesis 1 as a story of God creating physical matter, they have absolutely no idea how to understand day 7 because it doesn't make any sense. If you're talking about God creating physical matter and stuff, and then ending with the day of rest, your themes don't match. Because he's not creating physical matter, he's ordering the world. And we're going to look at some ancient stories here to make this point, okay? So the ancients, hopefully, thankfully, I should say, not hopefully, thankfully the ancients, they knew exactly how to understand what a God resting actually meant. So what we're going to do here is go through 2 ancient Near Eastern stories about gods resting in temples. Because when a god or goddess rested in their temple, that was always what they described happening when the temple was finished being built. So here's my question. What is a temple? In the most basic terms, what is a temple? Any guesses?
Like a pyramid?
It could be. Some could be built like that, perhaps in Egypt. I don't know. A ziggurat, I'll show you a picture of that some other time when we get to the Tower of Babel, had a pyramid-like structure, so it could be that.
I thought the temple was like something like a castle or whatever.
Like a castle. You're close. You're circling around the notion of it because they were big, grand structures that would strike us today as castle-like. But in the most basic term, when you're building a temple, you're building a what for a god? A building, a church, that could be one way that you might describe it. But who said home over here? Grant, Nick, you're absolutely right. A temple is just a home for a god. It's a place where a god lives, dwells, and administers their reign over land and territory. Okay? So in the ancient Near East, there was often a general order of events when it comes to creating the universe, the world, the physical creation, whatever you call it, that culminates in a god dwelling in a temple. So the gods fight one another. One god defeats another, gains some level of power over the other gods, and then that god will use that power to order the world as he wishes. And then he has a temple built for himself. Or the other gods have a temple built for him. And when that temple home is finished being created, the image of that god or goddess is placed within that temple. Now, think through Genesis 1. The image of God has already been placed in the world when we get to day 7. When God rests. The God being placed in the temple, the image of that God being placed in the temple was described as that God taking up rest in his temple home. And I describe that often as rest-adence. Instead of residence in the home, rest-adence. The God residing in that home. And when that God lived in that home, that God's reign truly begins. So I want to go through 2 ancient Near Eastern creation stories that are very, very important for reading the Old Testament. This first one is a Babylonian creation story. It's called Enuma Elish, which is the first words of the creation story in Akkadian. It was 7 tablets of stone, and they would recite this every year at the 7-day-long New Year's festival. It was the story of the creation of the world, the creation of Babylon, culminating in the creation of Marduk, their patron god's temple, after Marduk had ordered the heavens and the earth. And he does that after he fights and kills the chaos monster of the sea, Tiamat. Are you picking up on some of the themes that have been in Genesis 1? God fights primordial chaos. It's the watery depths that are right there in Genesis 1:2. God separates water from water. Pay attention to that. God builds the world to act and function as he sees fit, and then he rests inside his temple. Okay, so let's read this. This is from Tablet 4, lines 93 through 104. And what's happened here, and I've written this in red, so you can try and make a distinction about it on the camera. Marduk, one of the gods, has agreed to fight the chaos sea monster Tiamat on behalf of the rest of the gods, with the stipulation that he is to be made king of the gods if he wins the fight. Now what happens is, Tiamat is this sea serpent goddess. She's hell-bent on destroying the rest of the gods because they killed her husband, Apsu, who was a different sea monster, the father of the gods, but he turned into a tyrant and wanted to kill the gods. They took him down. They used his carcass to establish a different home where the gods would dwell. Earth hasn't been made yet. And then so Tiamat says, well, I'll finish my husband's work and I'll wipe out the rest of you gods, and then I'll return the world to primordial chaos the way that it was. So the gods get together in council and they elect Marduk to go and fight Tiamat. Marduk says, sure, I'll do it, but I get to be king if I win. And this picks up in the middle of the fight. By the way, Tiamat has also created a bunch of dragons and serpents and evil beings to go off and be her army against Marduk and the gods. But it comes down to this. Now I'm reading from the text in white. Tiamat and Marduk, the wisest of the gods, talking about Marduk, advanced against one another. They pressed on to single combat. They approached for battle. The Lord, Marduk, spread out his net and enmeshed her. The evil wind following after let loose in her face. When Tiamat opened her mouth to devour him, he drove in the evil wind in order that she should not be able to close her lips. The raging wind filled her belly. Her belly became distended, and she opened wide her mouth, and he shot off an arrow, and it tore her interior. It cut through her inward parts. It split her heart. When he had subdued her, he destroyed her life. He cast down her carcass and stood upon it. It sounds like an awesome fight scene. I agree. So basically, Marduk is going to fight his great-grandmother and Tiamat, who's hell-bent on killing everyone and everything and returning the world to primordial chaos. So he throws a net over her and he shoves a big wind in her mouth to keep her mouth open, and then he shoots her with an arrow, rips her apart from the inside, and then she falls over dead. Skipping ahead about 30 lines in the text, still on tablet 4, this is line 135 to 146. Marduk tears the body of Tiamat in half and uses the corpse to create the vaulted dome in the sky above, then creates the land called Ishara for 3 gods primarily. There's more gods than that, but he mentions 3 to live on. Okay, so the Lord, Marduk, rested. And here rested actually means the fight's over. So he's calming down after the fight. The Lord rested, examining her body, to divide her corpse and create ingenious things with it. He split her open in 2 parts. Half of her he set in place and formed the sky as a roof. He fixed the crossbars and posted guards. He commanded them not to let her waters escape. He crossed the heavens and examined the regions. He placed himself opposite the Apsu, the dwelling of Nadimud. The Lord measured the dimensions of the Apsu, the great structure, and a great structure rather. Its counterpart he established, calling it Ishara, which is land. The great structure Ishara, which he made as a canopy sitting on tops of the water of the Apsu, which is the corpse of their dead great-grandfather or something, whose name was Apsu, so they just keep the name. He was fresh water. Tiamat is the raging salt water of the oceans. Apsu was the freshwater chaos being that they've already conquered. The great structure Ishara, which is land now made on top of Apsu, which he made as a canopy, Anu, Enlil, and Ea, he then caused to inhabit their residence. So he takes the corpse of Tiamat and he splits it apart, and he keeps half of it below and half of it above. He makes the watery dome vault that we've already seen God do in Genesis 1, day 2. It's the same story. It's the same purpose, because they need to conceptualize the creation of the world somehow. It's the same phenomenological language here. This is how the Babylonians perceived the world to be made. These 2 gods fought it out. One god won the other, and he used its corpse, and he split the world, and then he built land on top of fresh water and kept the salt water at bay and on where fresh water dwelled, he built land and canopies and everything, and then the gods sat down and they filled the residence. This is still the language of resting. He's causing the gods to rest. Now, you can find the full story in something that looks like this. This is my copy of the entire Enuma Elish and other Babylonian creation stories. Again, there are 7 tablets, but the 5th tablet's probably the most damaged. A lot of what was written on these tablets is missing. So in the 5th tablet, what we can tell is that Marduk starts ordering the universe. He's made heaven and earth by the end of tablet 4. And what he does is he sets the gods in place in tablets 5, and for a lot of that is described as the constellations, because another way of thinking of the sun, moon, and stars was not just living beings, but in the ancient pagan minds, they were gods. And tablet 5, is best as what we have, is him putting the gods in their place in heaven. He makes them sit down and dwell where he wants them to be. And then we come to tablet 6, and this is lines 49 through 62, and I've thrown in line 65 for summary purposes. So now that Marduk has established heaven and earth the way that he wants it to be, to express gratitude for Marduk's victory over Tiamat and his ordering of the cosmos in tablet 5, the gods build a city called Babylon for them to rest in together. And Marduk gets a temple called Isagila to be his place of residence and rest, to rule over the world. And the text says this, Enuma Elish, tablet 6, line 49 says, "Now, O Lord, who has established our freedom from compulsory service," because he's also made humankind to do the work that gods didn't want to do themselves, "what shall be the sign of our gratitude before you? Come, let us make something whose name shall be called sanctuary. It shall be a dwelling for our rest. Come, let us repose therein. There let us erect a throne dais, a seat with a back support. On the day that we arrive, we will repose on it." Then when Marduk heard this, his countenance shone exceedingly, like the day. And he said, "So shall Babylon be, whose construction you have desired. Let its brickwork be fashioned, and call it a sanctuary." The Anunnaki, which is a lower class of gods, wielded the hoe. 1 year they made bricks for it. When the 2nd year arrived, he raised the head of Isagila on high. He sat down before them in majesty. This is the last line of tablet 6. So the story is, hey, Marduk, you did good. We're appreciative. You're our king now. So here's what we'll do. We'll build a city. We'll call it Babylon. And from there, you can sit down in your temple in majesty, and you can reign over the ordered universe that you have now made. So the Enuma Elish as a whole is about the creation of Babylon as a city. And it justifies Babylon's claim to actually be the rulers of the world. That's part of the propaganda that it was there for. And part of that propaganda was to say, we follow the god Marduk, and Marduk rules the world. Here's why. Here's the story of how that came to be. Oh, and he chose Babylon to be the place of his rule. And he sat down in majesty in this temple called Isagila. So you should follow Marduk and obey Marduk. That's the point of it. Now read Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, 1 through 3 in light of that. Who's the real ruler of the world, according to Genesis 1? Good. God. There's something going on in Genesis 1 that is directly related to this, but it's not the only story. There's a second story from Ugarit, which was Israel's immediate neighbors to the north. They worshiped a god called Baal, or I'll just pronounce it Baal here for simplicity, but Baal is probably a little bit more accurate term. So this is a creation story called the Baal cycle. It's got 2 parts. The victorious Baal, and then Baal defeats Mot. Mot was the god of death. But in the victorious Baal that I'll read from here, in this Ugaritic story, it's the defeat of Yam. Yam is the word for sea in Hebrew. Yam is defeated by Baal, and he establishes the world. Baal defeats Yam, a watery chaos serpent, and is declared king of the gods, so the gods build him a temple from which to rule the world. And after the 2 attacks by Baal with his weapons, Yam is defeated. So picking up here, this one doesn't get divided up into verses or anything. So I've just got it in paragraph form. And you'll see all the ellipsis dots in here because I've shortened it down for simplicity. So Baal and Yam are fighting. And afterwards, Baal dragged out and dismembered Yam. He destroyed him. And Asherah, it was either their mother or their sister, and I don't remember which one off the top of my head. Ishara answered, Yam is dead. Baal reigns as king. Then Yam said, I am certainly dying. Certainly Baal now will reign as king. Yet there was no temple for Baal like the gods, no house like the children of Ishara, the house of El, which sheltered his son. Baal and Yam were sons of El. I don't remember if Asherah is their mother or if Asherah is one of their sisters. Might be El's wife if I'm thinking correctly. So just to skip ahead, realizing that Baal is now king of the gods under the transcendent god El, Istarte. Okay, I've written here that Istarte is El's wife and mother of Baal. So either I'm wrong about that and Asherah is, and I got those confused, or Istarte is actually the right one. I didn't have time to go back and check yesterday. So Istarte convinces El to authorize the building of a temple for Baal in order to legitimize his new reign over the gods. So Lady Astarte answered, your decree, El, is wise. Your wisdom is eternal. So he's trying to butter up El. Our king is the mighty Baal, our judge who is the highest. We must all carry his tribute, yet he cries loudly. Listen, bull. El, his father, El, the king who installed him, he cries out, see that there is no temple of Baal like the gods. The compassionate El answered, let a temple be built for Baal like the gods. So Istarte goes to butter up El, and she says, look, we have to take our tribute to Baal. We're supposed to pay tribute to him. He's our king now, but we don't have a place to go. He doesn't dwell anywhere. We say he's king, but he doesn't have a home. Where is he supposed to rule from? And El gets buttered up, and she said, okay, yeah, we need to build a temple for El. Now listen to this language here. Tell me what this reminds you of. The temple was built quickly. The house was erected rapidly. Men traveled to Lebanon for its trees, to Sidon for its timbers. Fire was started at the temple, flames in the palace on the first day and the second day, and fire consumed the temple. On the third day and the fourth day, fire consumed the temple. On the fifth day and the sixth day, fire consumed in the middle of the temple. Then, on the seventh day, the fire died down in the temple, and the flames departed the house. The silver had turned into blocks, and the gold into bricks. The mighty Baal celebrated and said, I have built my temple of silver and my house of gold. And this is the last line of the victorious Baal part of the Baal cycle. Afterwards, Baal sat down and remained in his temple. Another way is he sat down and rested in his temple. This is just how these particular people translated this word. Remained, another word for that is rest. So, consider Genesis 1:1 through 2:3 alongside other ancient Near Eastern creation stories and see the commonalities. The Jews aren't writing this in a vacuum. They're writing it in light of these stories that they are infinitely more familiar with than we are. And they're trying to make a point about the real world. In these stories, the gods battle. But in Genesis 1, God battles the forces of primordial chaos and he sets up the world. But he doesn't personify them as gods. God establishes the image in the temple on day 6. We didn't really cover any of that in these readings because I knew I wouldn't have time. But when the temple was built, you put the idol or the image of the God in the temple. You did a little religious ceremony to open its mouth, and then that God came and resided in that idol, dwelled in that temple. On day 6, God puts his own living idol inside his temple. God finishes his work of building the cosmic temple by resting within that temple. And this is what we're getting at here. All of these stories share certain commonalities so that when we come to the end of creation in a 7-day period, like the temple of Baal, we're supposed to be getting a certain picture here. Genesis 1:1 through 2:3 is the story of God designing the entire world to be like a temple, a home for himself. He sits down to indwell that temple on the Sabbath. That's what day 7 is about. God sitting down to rule heaven and earth. Day 7 gives us the theological climax of the story. If day 6 gives the creation of mankind is a climaxes in the what gets created, day 7 is an even greater climax than that. Day 7, this theological climax, tells us how to read the other 6 days of the story in its ancient Near Eastern context. And if you don't know what that is from reading these other stories of God sitting down in their temple on the 7th day like Baal, you won't understand what Genesis 1 is actually about. This is Genesis 1 right here. This right here is the point. God is the ruling king who turned the formless chaos into a life-giving cosmic temple to rule over everything. And he willingly shares that ruling authority with humans, with you. But he is the high king. So we go from this slide here, which is what we've already seen, without day 6. But if you add day 7, now you get the end of the picture. It's kind of a goofy one, but it makes the point. God rests. He sits down and he rules creation as the king. So if this is all that you read in the story, and you ignore day 7 and its theological implications, you make humans the center of the universe. But if you actually read the story so that day 7 becomes the point of the story, God actually rules the universe. And humans are directly under him, but still the highest thing in the created order, but he transcends the created order. And you know what? When you get to Jesus, resurrected from the dead, what does he do when he ascends? He sits down at the right hand of God, a status and a position of authority that nobody else, not Moses, not David, not even Solomon, ever achieved. And new creation in Christ dawns. The gift of rest for creation. So if the theological climax is God resting, why does he actually institute a day of rest for the rest of creation? We've already said God is not a physical being. He has no need for rest. So his rest isn't about regaining physical strength and stamina. So what is the point of God creating a day of rest in physical creation? It's this. And this is why the Sabbath is on Saturday. Once every creation cycle of 7 days, we conclude the week by resting from our work in order to express trust in God as the real ruler over the creation. It means that we cease from working to exercise faith and trust that he did in fact sit down to rule the world, to fill creation with his glorious presence, and maintains it as his king. We're acknowledging that he rules beyond our efforts and power. So we can take 24 hours to take our hands off the wheel, sit down and relax, and remember that we're not really in control. And if you can't do that, you can't trust God at all. And you certainly can't keep the 4th commandment. And we'll end here. Remember to observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. You have 6 days each week to do your ordinary work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath day of rest dedicated to the Lord your God. On that day, no one in your household may do any work. This includes you, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, your livestock, so the animals get to rest, any foreigners living among you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and everything that's in them. But on the 7th day he rested. That is why the Lord blessed the 7th day and set it apart as holy. So on the 7th day, we take our hands off the wheel. We acknowledge that God is the rightful king and we do nothing. And we can talk all day long about what nothing is. But the whole point is to say, look, God, you're in control. I'm not. So Sunday morning, when that sun comes up, I'll get to work again. But I'm going to sleep now on Friday night, and I'm not going to work on this problem at all for the next 24 hours because I know that you are in charge beyond my efforts. So I'm just going to take a day and trust that the world is not going to fall apart if I'm not in control for the next 24 hours. Can you imagine if our politicians actually did that? Can you imagine if our households actually ran as if there was a greater person in charge than your parents? Can you imagine what our churches would be like if we actually practiced Sabbath as if somebody else had more authority over the church than we do as pastors? It would flip the world upside down because it would acknowledge a greater power than the people who are right in front of us. That's the point of creation, and that's what Genesis 1 has been building to all along.